Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I found a quote from Cardinal Sarah, and he said the following. You can see this on the screen here. And he said, the ban on celebrating the traditional Holy Mass is inspired by the devil who inspires our spiritual death. Now, this quote has been making its rounds throughout social media, and it is legit. He says, this quote is one of the translations. Cardinal Sarah does speak English as a second language, but he said the same thing to Penton, Edward Penton, a great Catholic journalist from, I believe, mainly writes for National Catholic Register, if I'm not mistaken. I know I've cited him a lot in my articles before. And he said as much in 2019. And he was speaking about the old Mass, and he actually said, you know, any attempt to ban the traditional Mass is only inspired by the devil. And he said who desires our spiritual death. Well, that's exactly what we're going through right now. And this is why, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that Pope Francis is not going to win. His crackdown on the traditional Mass is not going to succeed. It's not going to be painful. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be a disaster for a lot of people. Already, there are people who have experienced a crackdown on the Mass in their own diocese. Friends have reached out to me that live at various dioceses in the United States. And, you know, they were in tears on Sunday. Their last traditional Mass in their diocese was celebrated. Other people around the world, maybe they're still having Masses in their diocese, but they have to travel far and wide. They have to go, 45 minutes somewhere else to go to Mass at 3 p.m. in a church basement or something like that. This is all very stupid. This is all very dumb. It doesn't make any sense. But Pope Francis is not going to win. And not only because there are bishops fighting. Bishop Paprocki of his Springfield diocese, something like that, Illinois somewhere. He did find a workaround where he listed his parish church as a non-parish church, as an oratory or something like that, and therefore it doesn't count as a parish. I don't think it's going to work in the long run. I don't think that they're going, the way that the Vatican is dealing with traditional Latin Mass is sort of like how governments dealt with vaccine hesitant people who didn't want to partake in the, recent COVID regime. They basically do a slow bleed. People will think that they have found legal loopholes in the meantime. And then, when you're least expecting it, they're going to come with the hammer down and say, meh, here you have to have passports now and you can't go to your restaurants anymore. You can't fly. I think that's what they're going to do with the Latin Mass. I think these bishops are doing their best, but I do think that it's probably going to squeeze even harder. That being said, I am very hopeful that things will not continue, or they won't go as far as they could. They won't actually get rid of the traditional Latin Mass. And the main reason is because of what we see here from Cardinal Sarah when he says the ban on celebrating traditional Holy Mass is inspired by the devil. It is not inspired by the Holy Ghost. Getting rid of the traditional Mass is not God's will. We know that the traditional Mass is God's will because there's many, discerning God's will is not a matter of having some sort of charismatic, spiritual graces. Okay, sure. Exceptional things happen in your life and you can be given very clear signs by God. But we know what God's will is because we know what works in conformity with what God wills. And if that thing flourishes and it's in conformity with his will, then we can be certain that this is a sign from providence that this thing is God's will. The traditional Mass has been around for, St. Gregory the Great codified it in the, about 500 years into the church. By that time, it was already ancient. This thing is 1700 years old. And all the liturgies are old like that. And they sort of flowered from these original adaptations of the temple liturgies and things like that were adapted for the Christian faithful. And these things are as ancient as the church. And in fact, their roots are even in the Old Testament. There are many parts of the liturgies, both East and West, that are ancient, that actually contain explicitly the desires of God as found in the Old Testament. Anyway, the Old Mass, the traditional liturgy, is God's will. It has stood the test of time, and even against persecution, which seemed insurmountable, as my friend Michael Scott our friend Michael Scott in the office would say, it seemed insurmountable. It still lasted. It did not go away. And this crackdown is not going to work because it is of the devil. It is not of God. Now, one of the other things that gives me a little bit of hope here is I'm going to bring up a quick video here from Raymond Arroyo and Father Gerald Murray, and Rob Royal over at EWTN. And the reason why I find, so there's some snowplows going by, there's more climate change, so it's very snowy out today. The reason why this little clip here gives me hope, I'll explain after we just watch it quick here.
Is really doing is saying, we don't want you in the parish setting. So they are creating a rupture, it seems to my eye, and then saying, look, clutching their pearls over the rupture that's happening. Well, you're driving these people from the parish setting and sending them underground. Isn't that what's happening, Father?
Yeah, it's a basic violation of church order. There is no reason why any parishioner should be thrown out of his parish church. Absolutely none. The fact that Cardinal Roach and the Pope don't find the old Mass to be, useful or fruitful, or for them, a good expression of how we should pray, that opinion you can have. I think it's not a good opinion. I would like to discuss it with them. But please, for the love of God, don't turn around and tell, a family of 10 who's been going to Latin Mass for the last 30 years that you and your children have to get in your car and drive somewhere else because you're not going to be able to have Mass at your parish church where your children were baptized and made their communion and all the rest. This makes absolutely no sense. It's a persecution of Latin Mass Catholics, plain and simple. And it can't be justified by saying, well, this is going to help promote the mission of the church. This is damaging the church. It absolutely is. And in the United States, where there's a great love for the Latin Mass, I think most bishops would say, Holy Father, please, put a stop to this. Yeah. We do not need now Rome to tell people, get out of your parish churches if you like the old Mass.
So everything that Father Murray said right there, with his very congenial New York way of talking, qualitatively is no different than what Marcel Lefebvre said in the beginnings of the transition to the new Mass in the early 1970s. People, they think that the whole Society of St. Pius X controversy surrounds the consecrations of 1988, and that's sort of a flashpoint that a lot of people point to. But before 1974, Archbishop Lefebvre was essentially just continuing with his pastoral ministry, which was approved by the church, and was just forming priests the way they'd always been formed and just not getting with the program. He was just simply not saying the new Mass. His seminarians were not learning the new Mass. They weren't going to the new Mass. They were just going to the old Mass. And Catholics who were attached to tradition were seeking out the services of the priests of the society and the various other priests who were continuing. And they just continued on. And at that time, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre would say things like, you can't, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you can't tell me that I can't say the same words of consecration over the chalice I was ordained with. And, you can't say the same words over it that I said when I was ordained. And this was echoed by Pope Benedict XVI, who said, what former generations held sacred must still be held as sacred. Father Murray, he's very diplomatic, being that he's had to navigate the diocesan setting for so long. But what he's basically saying is this is absurd. This is damaging the church. You can't just tell people they can't go to the old Mass anymore. You can't just kick them out of their churches. He's saying the same things as Archbishop Lefebvre said, but there's a big difference. When Archbishop Lefebvre said it in the early 1970s, he was called renegade, a schismatic, and so forth. When Father Murray says it, he's looked at as a legal expert in canon law on the, mainstream Catholic media outlet in the United States. And I'm not begrudging this fact. I'm saying this is hopeful, and here's why. The fact that you can say qualitatively what is basically the same in substance as what Marcel Lefebvre was saying when they introduced the new Mass, and get away with it and not be called a schismatic. The YouTube critics will call people like me schismatics for whatever. But Father Murray, the fact that you can still be accepted by Catholic Inc., they'll still print your quotes in the Catholic news agency and not in a way where they're giving you a hit job. You can still appear alongside Raymond Arroyo. You know, you can say these things without being called a Lefebvrevist, a term that EWTN still uses unironically. I wish EWTN would clean up their act with that stuff. But in any case, the point being, in 1970, there were very few people standing up to the implementation of the new Mass, the exclusion of the old rite. And in fact, you know, Marcel Lefebvre was very much a traditional absolutist in the sense that he wasn't going to celebrate the new Mass. But if you look in his writings with the Holy Father and with the various congregations of Rome, he would say things like, please let us continue this experiment of tradition. He was very sharp in his critique of the new Mass, as I am as well. And like Father Murray, he believed that, thinking that the old Mass is not good for the church is a bad opinion. He'd like to talk to you about it. Well, Lefebvre was similar in that regard. But he wasn't calling for a complete abolition of the new Mass as the only way the church would go forward. He was willing to negotiate with the various hierarchs in the church, knowing full well that the new Mass was going to survive, even if the society was regularized in the normal sense. In many ways, Marcel Lefebvre was not extreme at all, and wasn't saying things much different than Father Murray. Father Murray is not asking for the abolition of the new Mass. Father Murray is not saying that the Pope does not have any control over the liturgy. Father Murray is not saying anything of the sort. He's just saying, clearly these people are faithful that go to the old Mass, clearly damaging the church by kicking them out into the peripheries, which Pope Francis apparently loves so much. Maybe they'll find Pope Francis there. Abusing them, persecuting them. This is bad. And he's right. He's right. And the fact that you can get away with saying this on mainstream Catholic Inc. in 2023 shows that the situation is much different than it was under at the time of Marcel Lefebvre. You see, in the 1970s, if you were standing up against the persecution of tradition, you were seen as a schismatic. But in 2023, now that Lefebvre has been vindicated in basically everything that he said, a conservative. I know Father Murray's traditionally minded. He probably says, I don't know him. I would imagine he says the old Mass. I know he doesn't exclusively say it, but I think he does say it. A very traditionally minded, orthodox, conservative cleric who can go on the mainstream Catholic Inc. podcasts and networks and things. A guy like that can get away with saying this and not be completely canceled. Yet to be seen. Maybe maybe he will be now that the Kennedy Report is talking about him with praise. So that's a kiss of death for some people, I guess. It just shows that we are not in the same position. We are in a position now where we know, we have, go back to this quote here from Cardinal Sarah, where he says, banning the traditional Mass is inspired by the devil. Goodness gracious. Again, this is exactly the sort of stuff that Marcel Lefebvre said back in the 1970s. But if you said it then, you were called a schismatic. You were called a renegade. There was, a crusade from modernist cardinals to get you canceled. Today, you can be a mainline conservative cardinal like Robert Serra. You can be a canon lawyer who appears on all the television shows like Father Murray, and you can be seen as just a stand-up guy. And this should give us great hope, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, the crackdown is going to get worse. It will. It will get worse. The papraki, workarounds where you're going to say, well, it's not really a parish, that's not going to last. And in the same way, I use the analogy of when they were implementing the vaccine mandates. When they were implementing the vaccine mandates, there was a small amount of people who held out and they said, there are exemptions exist, and say, okay, I'm going to apply for my exemptions. And then they'd be really strict on the exemption and they'd take away the exemption. And then eventually they'd say, I'm sorry, you're going to lose your job. Now there's nothing you can do. And you're not going to get a court date until, 2025. But the Vatican's operating the exact same way. They're letting people have a little bit of hope for now in the normal setting so they can demoralize them. That's the way Marxists work. And they're Marxists in the Vatican right now. But we're reaching a boiling point with even the mainline conservative Catholics like Father Murray. And this is what happened with the Freedom Convoy in Canada. There's a parallel here. A lot of people thought that what was going on during the lockdown and the implementation of vaccine mandates was wrong. A lot of people had enough sense to say, yeah, it's not very good, but they were willing to speak up about it. Eventually, it got to the point where it just got too far, and then the average person was saying, enough is enough. And they were willing to do something about it. And the rest is history. In a similar way, in the church, it's only been a small minority of traditional Catholics for a long time who have been speaking up about this. But now we're at the point where so many people have come to see that the traditional position is correct, or is at least a valid position. And they're at the point where they're willing to go, yeah, this is stupid. Enough is enough. It's not just Marcel Lefebvre crying out in the wilderness like it was in 1970. It's mainstream Catholic commentators going into hundreds of thousands of homes in North America and across the world on social media and podcasts and so forth, saying things that are qualitatively very similar to what Marcel Lefebvre said. It's cardinals who are very close with the who's who in the Vatican, like Cardinal Sarah, saying banning the Latin Mass is inspired by Satan. Again, this is another vindication of Marcel Lefebvre. So, yes, the persecution of the old Mass is going to continue, but it will not be the same as it was in 1970. In 1970, we had I wasn't alive. It's 18 years before I was born. No one knew what was going to happen. No one knew. There were many conservative bishops, traditional bishops, who did not like the direction the church was going in, but sort of trying to go along with the good nature of what it means to be a faithful son of the church. They said, okay, we'll give it a shot. And many of them died of a broken heart. Many of them did their best to sort of make it as reverent as possible. They retired. And then the 70s and 80s was an absolute disaster of epic proportion. But it was all unknown. If you were alive during the switching in the Mass, if you were, a teenager or a young child or something, you had no idea that you were going to leave your church one Sunday and you were going to come back the next and it was going to be a new religion. You had no idea. You had no idea what to expect. And by the time it happened, it was too late. It was all reactionary. Here, we know exactly what that looks like. This is not something where, we're waiting for this new liturgy to come along and they're promising us it's going to be great after this council that's supposed to be the best thing ever, only to show up to Mass and say, I didn't sign up to become a Protestant. What on earth happened here? It's a completely different time now. It will be difficult, but those who will be resisting will be many more. And in the history of the church, people need to get out of this. People need to get rid of this defeatist style of obedience that has gripped Catholics for so long. In the past, during crises in the church, where there were corrupt prelates, it was the case that entire cities would not revolt in the sense of be destructive and anarchistic, but there were uprisings, let's call it, where they would even demand that, a cleric resign. Or in the case of, St. Ambrose of Milan, they would basically demand that he be made the bishop. And the popular will of the people wanting a good thing for the church was recognized and these things were granted. Okay? We don't live in the church is, yes, we can call it a monarchy, but it's not a tyranny. That's not how it's supposed to operate. It's not for despots to just lord over your life and say, take your medicine even if it kills you. That's what Marxists do. But Anthony Fauci is not the one who runs the Vatican, although they're pretty much bosom buddies at this point. It's okay as a Catholic if you think this is wrong. It's okay if you're a Catholic and you're willing to do something about it to resist. There's nothing wrong with this. This is in the history of the church during times of great crisis and persecution from the leaders of the church, the civil leaders, whoever. The natural law allows us to resist and defend ourselves against aggression. You can't go too far. You don't turn it into a French Revolution. No one's advocating anything extreme. But like a Father Murray, who is, again, a sort of mainline conservative, traditionally minded cleric who appears in EWTN, he's okay with saying this is damaging the church. It is damaging the church, and you're not required to go along with the auto-demolition of the church, as Paul VI called it. Food for thought. It's going to be difficult, but Pope Francis is not going to win because what is happening is the will of Satan, as Cardinal Sarah said, and in the end, we know that St. Michael wins that battle, and Christ wins all the battles. So take heart, my friends. Let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.